In this video, we're going to get back to adding new features to our applications. And since we've already done our refactoring, it's going to be a bit easier to add these features in. What we're going to focus on is the individual item. So for the To-Dos app, that's the individual to-do. Right now, we just render a bit of text. For the Notes app, that's the individual note, and we just render a bit of text. This is not what the final version is going to be. For example, inside of the To-Dos application, we want a checkbox on the left of the text, and we want a delete button on the right of the text. Currently, we don't have that. We're going to focus on creating a more complex DOM structure in this video. It's going to use tools that we already know about, but we're going to be using them in a slightly different way. So we are going to go through the process together for the Notes app, and then you'll move through the process on your own for the To-Dos application. So how are we going to get this done? Well, first up, let's crack open the Notes app files. I'm going to delete these three right here for the To-Do app. I really wish there was a way to open all files in a folder. There's not. So I'm going to go ahead and crack open all three of these individually. And what we're going to do is focus on just changing a single function, generate note DOM. During the refactoring, we broke this out into a function. So if I want to change what shows up for the individual items, all I have to do is change what this function does. There is no need to change anything else in the program, which is fantastic. Now, the goal here is to get a delete button showing up alongside of the text. Let's go ahead and get a button showing up along with each note. So down below, we can go ahead and create a new element, const button equals. Like we would for any other element, we'll be using document.createElement. And if we're trying to create a button, we just pass as the first argument the string button. Now we have this button created, and we probably want to configure it in some way. Right now, we don't have any button text. Let's go ahead and add some into the mix. Right here, button dot text content. And I'm going to set text content equal to, you could use delete or remove. I'm just going to stick with the X character, which looks like a little remove button. Now, the last thing we have to do is actually get button showing up somewhere. And I'm going to go ahead and get it to show up inside of that paragraph at the very end. So down below, we are going to use notel dot append child like we've done plenty of times before, and we're going to be appending the button we just created. Now, we don't have to change any code anywhere else in our program. We can simply save the program with those lines in place, and right here, we get a little button next to each and every note. Now, currently, this button doesn't do anything, but that's okay. The goal here is to just get the correct DOM structure rendered. Now let's say that we want to put the X button before the title as opposed to after. If we wanted to do that, it's not going to be as simple as taking this line and moving it up above. We could try to do that and move it up here before we set the text content, but if we were to remove these empty lines and then save the file, we're going to see that we get an unexpected result. When we shift that line around, we can see that the button actually goes away entirely. What's happening here is that we start off with an empty paragraph, then we add the button in. After that, we set the text content. But when we set the text content, we're not appending it. We're completely overriding everything in that paragraph, which in this case includes the button. So this setup with two elements isn't going to work if we want to customize the order. Now that's going to be really important with the To-Do app where we want to put the checkbox before the text. So let's go ahead and explore how we can get that done over here. What we're going to need to do is create another element. We're going to have a container element. This is going to be a div element. And then inside of there, we're going to have our two elements, the text element and the button. This is going to make it possible to append one before the other to switch up the order. Let's go ahead and kick things off by taking this paragraph and switching it over to a div. Then we're going to create that new element right here. So const, I'll call this one P. Actually, let's just go ahead and call it text element. And I'm going to set it equal to document.createElement like we would for any other element. And we are going to go ahead and make a new paragraph. Now, when we set up the text element, we are going to need to append it. First up, let's make sure it has a correct text value down below. Instead of note element, we're going to use text element in both of those locations. And then right here, we just need to append it using note element dot. Right here, we're going to use append child. Then what are we going to do? Well, we are going to go ahead and append in the text element. Now, if we save things, we're going to see everything showing up as expected. We have our button coming first, then afterwards we have our paragraph. Now, paragraphs create a new line like we're seeing here, so the button is no longer to the side of the text. To fix this, we can go ahead and switch our paragraph out for a different tag. This is the span tag. A span tag is designed to be a little element for essentially moving stuff around like this. In this case, we can just put a bit of text in the span tag, and then we can append it in the correct order. It's going to have very limited styling, and if we save things, we can see that now everything is back on one line. Sure, things are a bit tight at the moment. We'll focus on that later in the course. For now, though, we do have everything in the correct order. We now have our X button first, and we have our note title second. If you ever get confused as to what you're actually rendering to the browser, you can always use the first tab, the inspect tab, to look at that document. I can use this little arrow right here to pick out one of the individual items, and then I can see the DOM structure. So we have our div with an ID of notes. In there, we have two divs, our two notes. Actually, excuse me, we have three notes. And if we open up an individual note, what do we get? We get everything that we just set up. We have a button with a text value of X, and we have a span with a text value of unnamed note. So this DOM structure right here from the opening and closing div tag, that is exactly what gets created and rendered because of this function here. Now, yes, this function is getting a bit unwieldy. We could easily see that as we add more stuff in, we're going to add more complexity, and that is true, but for the moment, it's okay. We'll look at alternative ways to get things done a bit later. For now, let's go ahead and add some comments to clean this up. Right here, set up the remove note button, and then down below, set up the note title text. So now when they scan it, they can see we create all of these elements. We then set up the button showing that first, and we set up the text showing that second. Now, I said when they see it, as if someone else is going to read the file. Even if no one else ever reads your code, it's important to still stay organized. That's organization through refactoring and organization through comments, because that's going to make your application much easier to work with, even if you're the only person to ever touch it. You'd be surprised how much you can forget about your own code after leaving a specific part of it, even for just a couple of days. By structuring things correctly and by using just a few comments, we're going to be able to make that process of picking up what's going on a whole lot faster. Now we're done for this application, and we're going to switch over to the to-do application. What I'm going to do is close down all of these files and crack open all of the ones for the to-do app. We got our HTML, we have our to-do app, and finally we have our to-do functions. It's going to be your job to modify our generate to-do DOM function. We not only want the text, the to-do text showing up, we also want a checkbox before the text, and we want a button to remove the to-do after. Up above, I can paste the comments, the steps that you need to go through. So first up, we're going to set up a root div. Then we're going to set up and append a checkbox. Then we're going to set up and append a span, and finally set up and append a button. Now for the span and the button, you just need to set the text value, something we already know about. For the checkbox though, remember that you need to use the type of checkbox as opposed to the default type for an input, which is text. To get that done, I'll give you the line. It's going to be some node dot, and then we're going to use set attribute. Set attribute allows you to configure one of the attributes for that specific element. In this case, we pass in two arguments. The first one is the attribute you're trying to set. We're trying to set type. The second argument is the value for that attribute. So if I wanted text, I would put in text. In the case of a checkbox, we want checkbox. So take some time to go through all four steps. You know you're done when you see a checkbox, your text, and then a button on the right. All right, pause the video. Feel free to refer to the code that we just wrote in order to figure out how to get that done. Then save your file, test your work, come back here, and click play. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and kick things off by creating that root div. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and kick things off by creating that root div. Down below, I'm going to actually start by just trashing everything, although you could have refactored the existing code, and we're going to make that root element. I'm going to call this one to do element. I'll set it equal to document dot create element, and we're trying to make a div. So right here, div. Now this is the element that we're actually going to be returning from our function, so we could add that statement in now, returning to do element. Everything that comes in between is going to be steps 2, 3, and 4, where we create the new elements and add them into the correct position. First up is our checkbox. Let's create the new element right here. That's the input const checkbox equals document dot create element. And you needed to create an element of the type input. Then we need to configure our input. So we have to set the type attribute equal to checkbox. Let's leave a little comment for where we are going to configure and render the checkbox. Setup to do checkbox. Let's start off by configuring that attribute using set attribute. That will be a call to checkbox dot set attribute. I'm going to set the type attribute. That's the first argument. The second argument is the value I want to use for the type attribute. And we know that for checkboxes, the correct value is checkbox. Now, before we can actually save it and see anything meaningful, we have to append this. So that would be to do element dot append child. I'm going to add into the mix our checkbox. Now, if we save things in their current state, we should see 2 checkboxes, and we do. So there is steps 1 and 2. Now we can move on to step 3, which is to create the span that actually contains the to-do text. Up above, let's make that. Right here, const to-do text equals document dot create element. We're just making a span element for a little bit of text. And then we're going to add that down below after our checkbox. So set up the to-do text. We have to do 2 things. We got to change the text content for that span, and we have to append it. To-do text dot text content equals, what text value are we trying to use? Well, it's under the to-do object, and the property is text. The second thing to do is to append it. Right here, we are going to append it onto to-do element. So to-do element dot append child. We are trying to append our to-do text element, and that should put a wrap around step 3. And there we go. We have our checkbox and we have our text. The last thing I wanted you to do was to also create a button that goes after the text. So let's knock that out, and then we'll be all done with this video. Right here, const remove button equals document dot create element. And for this element, we are going to be using button, and all we have to do is set its text and append it to the document down below. Right here, set up the remove button. I am going to use remove button dot text content to set the text content for that button. You could have used literally anything you liked. I'll just stick with an X, and then we're going to append it. So to do element dot append child, in the 3rd position, we are putting our button, remove button. And there we have it. That should put a wrap on all 4 steps for the challenge. I'm going to remove those challenge steps and test my work by saving the file. Right here, we have our checkbox showing up first. Then in second place, we have our text, and at the very end, we have our button. Now at this point, these inputs aren't doing anything meaningful, but that's okay. The important part for the moment is that they're all set up correctly. We have our individual items rendering well for the to-do app, and we also have them rendering well for the notes application. That's where we're going to stop for this one. In the next one, we'll start wiring up those event handlers. I'll see you then.